Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Sarah Hansen. I'm the Executive Director of Greater Portland Landmarks. For those of you who are new to Landmarks, we are a nonprofit organization founded in 1964 with a mission to preserve and revitalize Greater Portland's remarkable legacy of historic buildings, neighborhoods, landscapes, and parks. Our goal is to save Greater Portland's historic places through preservation and adaptive use while promoting creative new architecture that enhances neighborhoods. So this is our final panel discussion for Staying Above Water, our virtual symposium about sea level rise and historic preservation in our coastal communities. If you did miss our previous sessions, you can watch them on our website, which is portlandlandmarks.org. And also don't forget to register to hear our keynote speaker, Jeff Goodell, next Thursday at 4 p.m. So before I start, I want to thank our sponsors. New Center Maine, Systems Engineering, Gardner Real Estate, Heritage Company Coppersmiths, J.B. Brown & Sons, Sacco and Biddeford Savings Institution, Clark Insurance, Maine Home and Design. And this symposium is also supported in part by a Maine Bicentennial Project grant from the Maine Arts Commission, as well as by the Maine Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the CARES Act grant. Thank you as well, of course, to our preservation partners, our members, our board, our amazing staff, and all of our supporters. All of you make this work possible, so thank you. Last week, we talked about building awareness of the current and future risk to our coastal and communities. And today's focus is the future. So how can communities adapt to ensure that we meet the challenge of sea level rise in 2120? So we've got three great speakers today. Jim Nadeau of Nadeau Land Surveyors. Mr. Nadeau is a professional land surveyor and realtor. He is a member of the Greater Portland Board of Realtors Sustainability Advisory Group and is the land surveyor member on the Technical Mapping Advisory Council, a federal advisory committee that makes recommendations to FEMA. Next, we'll hear from our own Julie Larry, Director of Advocacy here at Greater Portland Landmarks. Julie is an architect and is working, leading our climate change work and as well as developing our property owner's guide for sea level rise mitigation strategies. And then finally, we'll hear from Troy Moon, the sustainability coordinator for the city of Portland. Mr. Moon is part of the One Climate Future team and joint action plan for Portland and South Portland, which is developing and adopting programs to address climate change and educate people about sustainability. So each panelist is going to give a presentation and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So as your questions come up, please just type them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen and hopefully we'll have time to get to everyone's questions. So thank you again so much for being here and I'm going to turn it right over to Jim.
Great, good morning. Thank you all very much for attending. One of the things that I wanted to bring up real quick is that there is a very similar parallel, sort of like railroad tracks as far as dealing with climate change as it is with dealing with flood. The analogy as well as the train on the tracks, climate change and increased flood risk is sort of the headlight on the train as it comes forward. We really don't know how far it is from us or how close it is, but it definitely is coming. So I'm going to touch on components of flood that I think are very much of common disconnects that folks that are using or making decisions on flood, but they're very similar when it comes to climate change as well. So if you can go ahead and understand that my understanding of what I'm trying to convey in flood really applies to climate change a lot, that would be very helpful in my presentation. So my first slide here is just talking about the flood insurance program in general. The last two bullets about home and businesses in high flood risk areas being required to have flood insurance. That's an important bullet because not everyone has mortgages, so the whole flood maps don't really come into play. So there's an understanding of why my neighbor doesn't have flood insurance and I do. Just remember that it's a program to identify risk for an investor holding the mortgage note, it's not really telling you what actual risk is going on with the maps. It is a guide to give you a better understanding of potential risk. The fourth bullet, as far as using a binary approach in determining flood risk, that is currently what the program is doing now. And the program recognizes that that is a big problem, because many people are saying that if I'm in the flood zone, I have risk, or maybe the maps are wrong, but if I'm out of the flood zone, then I don't have to worry about flood because the program says that I'm not at high risk. And that's a concept that needs to be changed. And that's what the program currently is doing now. Being on the Technical Mapping Advisory Council, that's a big component of what we're trying to do. We're trying to move away to graduated risk. That has a lot of application to climate change as well, because as the risk slowly continues to increase, we have to understand that it's not ever going to be clean because of the many parameters of flood risk, when it comes to size of storm, direction of storm, bathymetry of the coast, development, impervious surface, bad choices, poor engineering. There's a lot of reasons why you can't predict flood risk or how much impact climate change is going to occur. You just need to understand that it really is happening, and it's a very distant concept from the binary approach of being in or out of the flood zone. One of the things that the TMAC recommended last year is that, along with the three major components of mapping, insurance, and management, we have made a recommendation to FEMA that flood mitigation should be the fourth stool of the program. It's been since 1968 a three-legged stool. We're making the recommendation, even though there's a lot of mitigation concepts in the program in place right now, we're making the recommendation that mitigation has to have its own component because it's that important. So basically, real quick, with the base flood elevation, which identifies the special flood hazard areas on the flood maps, which are A zones or V zones, basically what they're saying is that this 1% annual chance storm, when that storm comes in, the water is going to stop at that level. So in the binary approach, any elevation of a building that's above this line here is safe from flooding, or more importantly, not safe from flooding, but just doesn't have the mandatory insurance requirement if a loan is in place. That's really what this program's main driver is determining risk for the investor holding that mortgage note as an investment. It's not telling you actual risk. And here comes the base flood. And of course, it'll just stop at that 1% annual chance. I went to the wrong line there, but my apologies there. But if the water doesn't increase that way, the program recognizes that improvement as being safe from flooding. And 26% of all the claims on flood risk happen outside of the flood zone with this 1% annual chance. So you can see it definitely is not capturing actual risk. Really important when we start making our decisions with climate change as well, that maps will always have its limitations as far as projections, and mitigation is an important component of getting ready for climate change or improved flood risk. Taking a look at a couple real quick maps here. This is down in Orchard Beach here, and this area here is on the current flood map. And that area says that it's not in the special flood hazard area, the shaded area. These are the preliminary maps. And just to make an understanding, you can see that whole area is now gone. It's going to be in the special flood hazard area when the new maps come in. So really what's happened here in this scenario, the perceived risk or the map risk has changed substantially for these folks that are in this area. If they have that loan, they're going to get flood insurance. But it's really important to understand that their actual risk really hasn't changed because their distance from the flooding source or elevation from the flooding source has not changed. And it's a big disconnect with the program in the sense that it always just talks about risk. It doesn't talk about actual risk or map risk that can be very different. And the next slide here, this is the opposite that's happening. This is up in the old Falmouth or Portland North. This is where the Shaw's is and the TD Bank North there. That red box here is here on the map now. And you can see that all this development is not captured in this particular map because the map hasn't been updated. So in this particular case, actual risk has changed a lot, but perceived risk or map risk has not changed because the map has not been revised. So when you make your decisions with climate change, no different with flood risk, you really need to understand that there's two types of risk, what the scientists and engineers are trying to model as potential risk and what actual risk is really going to happen. And you always want to be very conservative with what the maps say and prepare for the worst, because the maps are never going to capture the change of flood risk as you move forward. An important component on the flood maps is these models are done actually from historical data and current engineering modeling. They don't take accelerated rates of sea level rise into play when these make these maps. So there's a weakness there as well as you get ready to try to prepare best for climate change moving forward. This map here, we all know exactly where it is that this is the back cove. This blue box here is Whole Foods. This shaded area is the current flood map in the back cove. On the preliminary maps that were dated in 2017, this tan shaded area is the 500-year flood, not the 100-year flood. That area right there is generally the area that gets cumbered with a lot of the backing of the water coming from the back cove. This area is not going to be called the 100-year flood and would not require mandatory insurance. And I just want to take time, that's why I bring these up and the other two maps up, to show you that there is a huge difference between actual risk and perceived risk. And the reliance of maps alone as you prepare for climate change is a dangerous thing for many reasons. One, for budget constraints or development, change of impervious surface. It's never going to capture what is happening with actual risk as we move into the future. One of the big disconnects that I see often is the word hazard and risk being used interchangeably, no different than accuracy and precision when it comes to data. Just remember that as the hazard increases, so does your risk. And that is something that is going to continue to occur with flood as well as with the climate change. So remember that there's a big difference between hazard and risk when you start evaluating your best options. One of my big kickers, even though I'm a land surveyor and I do a lot of data collection and certified elevations very precisely, one of the big obstacles that I believe will fix or improve the flood program in no different than preparing best for climate change is understanding what we have for systematic biases on how we make choices. I think we all want to believe that we see the world as it is, but we really see the world as we see it based on our education, our background, our experiences, etc. And we taint the real perception of how things are playing out based on our belief systems. And systematic biases are something that came up in last year's TMAC report, and it's something that's very applicable with climate change, the understanding that it's never going to happen to you, it's not going to impact me much, needs to be pulled away, because I think that it's a behavior component in preparing for flood risk correctly, as well as dealing with climate change, has to be obstacles that we have to get by. So I have a few more slides left. This one here is one of the slides that FEMA has had out published for quite a while, and you can see the acronym of FRED. Flood-proofing, relocate, elevate, or demolish are the four items that FEMA has had in their books for a long time as far as how to best prepare for flood risk or a change of flood risk. These all are choices that we can make by changing our behavior and preparing for climate change as well. Other ones on the right side, the 500-year flood is a 0.02% annual chance risk of flood. you can start making choices to move away from the 100-year flood. The state of Maine has a freeboard that whatever the base flood elevation is, the lowest floor needs to be at least 1 foot above that. Oh, my apologies. Some of the communities around here actually add additional freeboard. You as a homeowner can add additional freeboard as well, as long as you don't meet or exceed DEP height requirements. Flood event openings offset hydrostatic pressures and hydraulics of floodwaters in basements. Of course, there's mitigation grants, beach nourishment components. Just don't have a lot of time to get into these, but there's a whole lot of ways to be proactive for flood. And they're all very applicable ways that you can mitigate and prepare actually for climate change as well. It's a choice to do it, and that really leads back to the behavior of stop believing that it's not going to happen to you and prepare for it. You know, there's a wonderful quote that I keep in my mind a lot from Ben Franklin: by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. And I think there's a harsh reality that that's what's going on with climate change and increased flood risk. And I think it's a personal choice to decide how you move forward, but it really is happening, and there is a way to best prepare for that. I'm going to go ahead and skip to my last slide, which is just 3 away. Well, first of all, I'll do this one. My apologies. Is one of the other things that FEMA is doing now as well is they're actually putting high water marks out there to show you where actual flood risk reached. And these are very impactful. These really trump what the maps show, because this is harsh realities. These arrows that are up on the trees here, that's the floodwaters in Katrina back in 2005. That is just a very devastating picture about how much water really came inland. And the last picture that I have with that is this is down in Miami, of doing projections of what the scientists are projecting as far as sea level increases, where it's going to impact on the sides of buildings that are currently existing now. So there's a lot of different ways to start getting your education up as far as how to best prepare for it, but there is a reality that it is coming. And then I'll just go to my last slide here. Is this acronym that I created, which was SAVE. And you can see the different safety, asset, value, and environmental reasons why we should go ahead and consider mitigation as a vital component of getting ready for climate change. The National Institution of Building Scientists found that every dollar we invest in mitigation, it saves $6. So in the whole concept of getting ready for climate change, I know there's folks out there that might not believe that it's real, or it's going to take a very long time, or it's not going to impact me in my lifetime. But at the same time, if you look at safety, asset, and value protection, even if climate change wasn't happening, my argument would, why wouldn't you want to do it? Because it's protecting your buildings, your homes, your people, your wealth, maybe slow the increase of taxes, etc. So it's a real good reason to go ahead and just get ready for climate change, because there's a lot of benefits by just understanding the importance of mitigating. So I think that's it. I didn't want to run over on my time. Always have a whole lot more to talk about, but I just wanted to not go over my time frame. Thank you.
Great, Jim. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I'll just go ahead and hand it straight to Julie.
Thank you, Sarah. So last week I talked a little bit about why landmarks was interested in pursuing this conversation around climate change and sea level rise in regards to historic properties and our mission to preserve historic buildings and neighborhoods. So we talked a little bit about what was happening, what could possibly be lost, and what was about our historic development patterns was causing us to have an elevated risk. So this week I want to talk a little bit more about what needs to be done. We have, through our documentation projects the last 2 years, been looking at what some of the challenges are to properties in the neighborhoods we've been studying in Bayside, in Ferry Village, in South Portland. And so we have taken what those elements that we see as potential hazards, and we're looking at what we can do to mitigate those. We'll also be doing continued documentation going forward, and we're also focusing some of our advocacy on policy issues, and I'll be touching on all of those today. I mentioned that we've been doing projects both in Bayside in Portland, as well as Ferry Village in South Portland. Those were 2 areas that we've identified as at very high risk from sea level rise. And of course, as Jim showed us, we know that's already happening in Bayside. We've also been doing some documentation in the Portland waterfront. And we have been doing that in conjunction with the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, and the Maine Office of GIS has created a layer that has the data set of information that we've been collecting. And here is the link to where you can find that. And each one of those dots, if you click on them, represents a house, and you can see what some of the features are for those particular properties that put them at a higher risk. I mentioned that we're also engaging in policy discussions, both the Maine Climate Council as well as the One Climate Future program that Troy will talk a little bit more about in a few minutes, have recommendations that are coming forward both at the state and local level. And some of those will have impacts on historic properties. We've been engaging with both of these policy issues throughout the process of the data collection and recommendations, and we will be continuing to do that. Now I want to get a little bit more down into the nitty-gritty of what can you do if you have some hazards on your property. So if you have basement windows that are either low to grade or openings in your foundation, you can do a couple of steps that can help reduce the amount of water that could potentially come through those openings and flood your basement. There's weather protection sealant that can go around basement windows. One of the things that's probably a very efficient and low cost thing to do is to regrade around your windowsills to direct the water away from those basement windows. You can also install flood barriers at basement windows and vents. In the Bayside area in particular, there are a number of properties that are commercial or retail in nature that have at-grade entrances. There are products on the market that are either flood shields or barriers, whatever you would like to call them, for entrances at grade that can help stop the water from coming into buildings. If you have a flood-prone basement, there are a number of things that you should do to prepare for increased flooding. You should be anchoring your fuel and oil tanks and hot water heaters and furnaces. Because particularly for the fuel tanks, those can tip over in a flood situation and have really a strong environmental impact, as well as they could potentially cause a fire, which is even more damaging than the flooding could be. You can elevate your mechanical equipment as well as your appliances to get them up off the floor. So if you have a few inches of flooding in your basement, you could set things up a foot or two above the floor. You can also relocate your mechanical equipment to either the roof, if you have a flat roof within your attic space, or some other living area that's above the flood levels. Particularly challenging is utility entrances because you have to work with your utility provider, but there are options for raising utility entrances, which we have found in both neighborhoods that we have done a lot of data collection in is particularly a challenge. There are ways to raise your utility meters or to raise a circuit breaker and elevate your main panel outside of the basement, so that in case of flooding. I mentioned earlier about regrading around the house. This one is particularly important. Even if you're not in a potential flood zone, or you think you're going to be experiencing sea level rise, just having strong rain events, you can get a lot of flood right around the perimeter of your house, which can come back in through your foundation wall. And that's usually because your site isn't well graded. In this particular scenario, it shows compaction or settled backfill up against your foundation wall. But what we also see in a lot of cases is people who do foundation plantings often put a lot of mulch around the bottom of their the plantings that they put in, and that usually occurs out in this area, and they create a little gully or swale right up against the foundation, and the water can stay there and pond and then come back through the foundation wall. So it's always good to have drainage that moves away from your foundation and slopes out towards the rest of your yard. Here's a couple of examples of situations where you can have that water moving towards your foundation. It's important to check your sidewalks and your driveways to make sure they haven't settled over time. As in the top photograph, you can see there's some ponding here and the water is moving towards the foundation. Likewise, you may live in an area with some topography where your neighbor is higher than you are, and the water comes downhill towards your foundation and creates a wet basement situation. You can create, as in this sketch here on the right-hand side, a swale that can capture the water, let that water sink naturally down into the ground, or perhaps direct it away towards your backyard or someplace else where there may be less chance that the water will come back at your foundation. It's really important to also think about managing change that will happen either through sea level rise or climate change. And one of those things is, what can we do about stormwater runoff? Encourage people to use rain barrels. They're great if you're like me and you love to garden. Didn't get particularly a lot of rainwater in the rain barrel this year, but certainly I hope that we won't always be in a drought situation, and rain barrels can be a wonderful way to capture water on site and to use it, and then rather than have it go into the storm system. Also, it's really important to help protect your foundation to make sure that downspouts are extending away from the foundation. We recommend at least 6 feet from the basement wall. Another thing to think about is in storms, you can have high winds, and it's important to yearly, both in the spring and the fall, to walk around your property and look at things that may need to have some work done. Keeping tree limbs pruned, remove trees that are dying or damaged, and make sure features like satellite dishes or antennas are secured to your building. Another element of managing change with your historic property is definitely consider alternative energy options. Greater Portland Landmarks supports the use of solar panels in historic districts and on historic properties. There are some things to consider if you're installing them. It's great if they can be installed flat and not alter the shape of the roof. We always encourage any changes that you do to your property not to damage the historic integrity of the resource. So that is how you attach them to your roof, making sure that you're not damaging the chimney or any other historic features of your property. Not removing historic roofing materials is critical, and not using installation procedures that can cause irreversible damage or changes to your historic roof elements. There are a lot of resources out there for homeowners if you're interested in learning more about ways that you can mitigate the risk that you have on your historic property. FEMA has a number of bulletins that they have produced in the last decade or so. Other communities and states also have some guidelines that they have put out, and we can certainly connect you with some of those. And as Sarah mentioned, we will be publishing next week our Staying Above Water, our Property Owner's Guide, which has some of this information that I've just gone over today. You can go to our website and sign up to receive a digital copy when it's published. And that's what I have. I'll turn it over to Troy.
Great, thank you, Julie. So my name's Troy Moon. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Portland. And I guess today I'll be talking about kind of the broader community approach to climate change. We heard some great presentations kind of dealing with the specificity of how a property owner might address climate change impacts and flooding impacts on their own property. But the cities of South Portland and Portland have joined together to create a joint climate action and adaptation plan that will guide our policy actions and our efforts as communities up until 2050. So we have a 30-year plan. And we're really excited about this because as far as we know, we're the only two communities that have joint climate action plans. And we think that's really special because, you know, both our communities realize that the efforts that we make together will have more impact if they are synergistic and we're taking action that, you know, from each community that amplifies and complements the actions taken by the other community. So we're really excited about that. And, yeah, and as you know, we've seen in the previous presentations, we know that impacts of climate change are already happening. And we saw the pictures of Bayside, and you know, we know that Portland Pier goes underwater pretty regularly. So we know this is happening. We know we have to get ready, and we're really pleased and excited that our elected officials and policymakers are on board with making, taking action and making our communities ready for the impacts of climate change. So I'm going to share a few slides myself here. And so I'm going to start out with our mission statement. The mission of the One Climate Future Plan was to promote a more sustainable community now and into the future, because what makes our communities really special is the really high quality of life. We have a great art scene, and where everyone loves Casco Bay and just the beauty of the area. And so people love living here because it's just a great place to live. And we think it's important as our guiding principle for our plan was how do we maintain this wonderful quality of life in the future that we know will be impacted by climate change. Even if we stopped emitting carbon today, we know that by 2050, we're likely to see another 3 degrees Fahrenheit of average temperature, which will change our climate, will lead to higher sea levels and impact how we do things. But I think it's really important to talk about what do we mean by having a sustainable community. And Jim mentioned they're upgrading their hazard stool to a 4-legged stool. I'm still looking at a kind of a 3-legged stool or interlocking circles of what sustainability means to us. Most people, when you think of sustainability, what comes to mind is environmental sustainability, which is certainly really important. And as we move, towards 2050, we want to make sure that we're using our environmental and natural resources really wisely, reducing waste. We want to work really hard towards developing a circular economy so that we're regenerating the environment and not being so extractive. We also want to emphasize social sustainability. As we move into our future impacted by climate change, we want to make sure that we have equity as a key focus of our effort. We want to make sure that everybody in our communities is able to participate in the economy, in our society, regardless of sexual orientation, gender, race, ability. We really want everyone to be able to have walkable communities, have access to green energy and healthy foods. So that's got to be a focus of what we're doing. And finally, economic sustainability is vital too. And to do that, we want to make sure that our communities are investing in businesses and economic activity that coincides with our One Climate Future values. We want to, work with businesses and that are anchoring neighborhoods that are walkable, so people can enjoy amenities near their homes. Won't have to drive cars. Getting people out of cars is a huge part of our plan. We also need to make sure that we're really thinking hard about, as city governments, that we're using our financial resources wisely. There'll be lots of investments in the future. We want to make sure that, our policies, our fiscal policies in our communities help us maintain our high bond ratings so we can, access capital markets. But we also want to make sure that we are being mindful of the financial burdens we're placing on our citizens with fees and taxes. So we just have to be mindful, and economic sustainability is certainly just as big a component of our plan as the other two elements. And today we're just going to be able to like scratch the surface of our One Climate Future plan. And I invite you to download it. It's available on oneclimatefuture.org. So please visit that and download the plan and dive into it in more detail. We talk about, taking actions in a number of sectors: buildings and energy, transportation, land use, waste reduction, and creating a more resilient community. But it's really important to note that all of the elements, all of the, the plan elements are very integrated and networked. So we really wanted to think about how do we talk about them as a whole, and in a more comprehensive way, because it's really not siloed. And I think that's really one of the really big important things to remember about our climate action plan, is that breaking silos is essential. We really need to think holistically and understand how actions we take in one area of this community will impact the others. So we created our executive summaries around what we're calling 6 big moves that kind of capture the networked element, the networked aspect of our plan. So really the number one key thing we need to do is build better buildings. And this is an audience I think that is going to be a great ally for us and a partner moving forward. Is to buildings are essential to our community, and in Portland and South Portland we have an old building stock. Most of the square footage that exists in the city now will certainly be in existence in 2050. So how do we make sure that our buildings are energy efficient, warm and comfortable, and ready to deal with more rain, higher seas, etc. So our key milestone in the better building areas, make sure that at least all new buildings are net zero energy starting in 2030. But if we look at our policy wedge and where our emissions come from, existing buildings are huge. So we need to put a ton of effort into working with homeowners and property owners and business owners to help them access private equity and private capital to upgrade their buildings, help direct them towards renewable energy, and move away from fossil fuels, natural gas and oil, which are currently our primary way of heating and cooling our buildings. Number 2, we want to connect people to places and to opportunities. So again, getting people out of cars is a huge effort we want to undertake. So by 2035, we want to make sure that 26% of our trips use public transportation or active transportation, which is more than double of what we're currently doing. We want to make sure, and it's been a great conversation in Portland that's been going on, is how do we grow housing to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to, everyone who works in Portland should have an opportunity to live here. And the city has a goal that should happen by 2030. So we were able to take that goal and move it into our climate action plan. And so we'll be implementing policies to do that, really develop walkable communities, kind of right in line with Portland's Plan 2030, is look at building neighborhood nodes where people can live, work, play, and recreate all within a walkable distance from their community. And renewable energy is essential. It's really the key, one of the main linchpins to being able to achieve our carbon reductions, become carbon neutral by 2050. So we have very ambitious goals in terms of solar. We'd like to see 50 megawatts of rooftop solar by 2030, and 245 megawatts of rooftop solar in Portland, in South Portland, by 2050. So that's going to take a huge leap, because that's certainly not where we are today. But it's really important to note that state policy is super important. You may have heard of something called the Renewable Portfolio Standard, and that's where the state of Maine has committed that 100% of our electricity will be produced by green energy by 2050 and 80% by 2030. So that's really a key towards making sure that we achieve our goal. But we're going to have to work really hard at the state and federal level to make sure that we continue policies that allow us to electrify transportation and building energy use as much as possible. Growing a circular economy is going to be key. We mentioned reducing waste, so we want to make sure we work hard to get organics out of the waste stream. So we're saying we'd like to see 70% of our organics community-wide, whether it be from restaurants, homes, business cafeterias. We want to see that to 70% be covered by 2030. And we want to see our communities be zero waste communities by 2050, which so we're going to promote reduce, reuse, and recycling, which we want to make sure that everyone in our communities have access to recycling programs, ways to reduce their waste, and continue the work that we've been doing to eliminate single-use plastics, such as plastic bags and styrofoam containers, which we've banned those, and our plastic straw ban is going into it's currently kind of modulating by January. Plastic straws will be legal in Portland, so we're going to continue to work on reducing those elements of waste. Nourishing ecosystems. We love our natural environment here in Portland and South Portland because it offers so many benefits. It manages stormwater, and really importantly, it manages heat, because we know that as temperatures rise and we have more and more high heat days, ways to mitigate that heat is going to be really important. So one of our ways to do that is to reduce impervious surface and offer more trees and green space. So we want to make sure that by 2050 that we convert additional 15% of the impervious surface, whether that be parking lots or streets, to green infrastructure by 2050. And we want to make sure that all residents are living close enough to a park where they can walk easily. So that's and then certainly continue the efforts that both communities have made to clean up stormwater, handle stormwater, and make sure that we keep Casco Bay healthy and clean, so it can be the resource in the future that it is today. And finally, again, this is a plan that the city governments in both cities can't do this ourselves. So it's really a collaborative process. We need to build capacity to collaborate with partners, business leaders, community organizations, neighborhood organizations, and just regular individuals who we want to change. We're asking to think about how they do their day-to-day activities, whether to think about walking and driving and living and supporting policies that create more dense communities where people don't have to drive their cars everywhere. And one of the programs that in the plan that we're really excited about is we're calling it a neighborhood resilience program, neighborhood sustainability program, that we can collaborate with the neighborhood organizations who have great connections with their neighborhood members, the people who live in their community, and to promote the activities that the neighborhood organizations can lead to make their neighborhoods more sustainable, whether it be helping neighbors weatherize their homes, or doing neighborhood cleanups, or just developing stronger social bonds with neighbors in their community, so that if there are climate or storm weather related impacts, people are able to respond more resiliently because they have relationships and histories of collaboration with their neighbors. So That's really like a no-cost way to really make the community more connected and more resilient. And I think, and we talked a little bit about this in the previous two speakers, but investing in the future is going to be essential. So we know the Maine Climate Council just issued a report that we could see in Maine huge economic impacts from damage to sea level rise and other weather-related impacts, and huge losses of jobs by 2050. So it's important that we make investments and think about, as we build new infrastructure, as we make modifications to our built environment, that we invest in a little bit up front to make sure that we can better withstand the impacts in the future. So we're not reinvesting money on to replace or rebuild or restore things that were damaged. That if we had just spent a little bit more up front, we could have avoided massive costs that we didn't have to accrue if you were just wise in how we spent our money. And again, this is just a brief overview. I totally invite you to look at the plan more clearly. The city of South Portland just adopted the plan this week. Their council voted to adopt it. In Portland, the Sustainability and Transportation Committee has endorsed the plan. We're doing a full council workshop on the 26th, and we expect that the Portland City Council will adopt the One Climate Future plan on November 9th. So we're really excited about this plan, and certainly happy to have any questions as part of the Q&A. So thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Troy. Thank you again, all three of you, so much for wonderful presentations. We do have a bunch of questions, so we can go ahead and get started. The first one is actually for Jim. Where is the best source of information for my home's flood risk?
Good question. The first place you would want to start is right in the FEMA website, FloodSmart. FEMA Map Center actually shows 3 sets of maps: the current maps, the preliminary maps if the transition hasn't been made yet, but equally as important, the historic maps, which allows insurance agents to rate built-in compliance structures prior to a map change. So the FEMA Map Center or FloodSmart is a great place to start.
Great, thank you. This one is probably general. I hear that most things we think are being recycled aren't really, plastics being number one. If this is true, shouldn't that be made more known? Grocery stores need to help reduce this problem by not packaging things in them. I don't know if any of us have comments. I know, Troy, you talked about eliminating single-use plastic as one of the goals of One Climate Future.
Sure, happy to take a stab at that.
Great.
So we in Portland, in South Portland, and southern Maine generally work with Maine, which is a waste handling agency. It has a waste energy plant that handles the trash, and we accept compost. We also have the largest recycling plant in the state. So recycling actually is very important, and it really depends on the product. So paper and cardboard and all those paper products are super useful and valuable, easily recyclable, and really important feedstocks for new products. So plastics are really kind of complicated and confusing, and some plastics have more value than others. So certainly like clear plastic jugs, than like a water bottle, like you might see like the Poland Springs water bottle. Those are all really actually pretty valuable and useful plastics that there are great markets for. There are lesser grade plastics that are more difficult to recycle, and so those are more challenging. And so the best option, certainly, if you look at the waste hierarchy, is reducing the use of plastic. So we certainly encourage people to have reusable containers, getting away from your plastic forks and your plastic straws they're not recyclable. at all, and styrofoam packaging, which the cities have banned, not recyclable. So you're really avoiding the use of those things that just are not recyclable is the best choice. But there are plastics that are recyclable. It's just those higher grade ones that are, particularly the clear ones, are much more useful. But if it's a container of some sort, then it's something that we can recycle, and we actually have markets for them. But things that aren't containers are much more difficult.
Great, thank you. Next one is for Julie. Do you have tips on prioritizing different mitigation work for houses and neighborhoods that are affected by flooding and sea level rise?
Well, it's always good, depending on your budget, to prioritize those things. There are certainly some things that you can do that are low cost. Doing some sealing around your windows, that's mostly your labor and the minimal cost of doing some sealing if that's what you need to do. Doing lots of yard work or a big, a foundation drain, those things are going to be more expensive. So it really depends upon your site, the elements that you have that are putting you most at risk, and then prioritizing them on an individual basis versus your budget and what you can do. You can always give us a call. If we can't help you specifically, we can put you in contact with people who can help you make decisions like that, particularly if you're doing a bigger type of project.
Thanks, Julie. Next one is also for Troy. Does One Climate Future have a strategy for all the utility upgrades that will need to happen, such as panel upgrades in older houses, moving utilities that are in flood zones, grid upgrades? I think this is especially a good question, given that the Maine Climate Council is, a lot of their recommendations are focusing on switching us to more reliance on the electric grid for heating and cooling and moving away from fossil fuels. So
yes, as you noted, one of the most significant policy wedges is electrifying almost everything. So we're going to be spending a lot of time, and a lot of this is really in its infancy. Doing the policy work. We know we need to bring more electricity onto the Portland Peninsula, particularly. We know that we need to, again, deploy lots of solar. So we're going to have to be working, again, with homeowners, with business owners to help them make that transition. So we're thinking about, if you look at the plan, there's, talks about the different strategies and then how do we pay for it. And so we have plans about how do we help private property owners access, capital. We've been really advocating at the state level for a commercial property assessed clean energy bill that would help, communities like Portland, South Portland, use our lien authority as basically a security for business owners to access low interest, long-term capital to make that type of infrastructure upgrade. But so a lot of it's going to have to be about education, helping people understand what those changes they need to make are, and then again, helping them find the funds to make those changes. So yeah, absolutely, that's going to be huge.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for at least one more, maybe a couple more. Jim, this one I think is probably for you and Julie too. Was curious about the coordination between federal agencies on a lot of these issues, especially if, the relationship between FEMA and the National Park Service. A lot of the mitigation strategies that are coming out of this, such as raising buildings and moving them and things, don't meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, which is kind of the bedrock of historic preservation. I don't know, Jim, if you have any idea, or if you've been involved in any coordination between those agencies and kind of like how can we help move that conversation forward so that we're getting, making sure that federal policy is keeping up with a lot of things that are happening at the local level?
It's a great question. Not been involved with it too much, but I do know that one of the big things that happened recently with TMAC was that there was discussion that USGS was going to take over the mapping program. But as we continue to delve into the transition to graduated risk, the TMAC is made up of NOAA, the Army Corps of Engineers. There's a lot of different federal agencies. We're all working together at the same table to try to implement the program at a higher level. The unfortunate component that I'm finding with TMAC is it is in Washington, and there is some politics involved with that process. So it's not necessarily quick, but everybody is at the table and working together. National Park Organization is not, but there's a lot of federal agencies that are there trying to knock heads to make this better for everybody.
Great, thanks, Jim. A couple more questions. We've got one. What is a complete street? I'm happy to answer that, but Troy, do you want to take it? No, go ahead.
Sure, you can add what I get wrong. So basically, it's creating a street that's equally useful for all people who are traveling. So whether it be a person in a motor vehicle or a bicycle or walking, but also we want to integrate natural elements and stormwater management as well. So basically, not thinking of a street strictly as as a way to move about. It's a public space, and we wanted to offer all the amenities that a public space should offer, while while working with any mode of vehicle travel.
Nailed it. Next question is, and I don't know if we'll be able to answer this one, but is there any legislation under consideration that will limit packaging? I think that refers back to the earlier conversation we were having about plastics.
Yes, there is actually.
Right.
So there was actually a bill last session in the legislature that was called a producer responsibility bill that would require the manufacturers of packaging to be responsible for the end-of-life use of those like wrappers and boxes and mailers and all the types of consumer packaging, because right now they just sort of foist it on the public, and so community neighborhoods, cities are responsible for handling those. So the plan would have been to make them pay for it, which ideally would give them some more incentive to reduce the amount of packaging and the weight of the packaging they use. And also, as you know, the state's ban on plastic bags goes into effect. It was kind of delayed because of the pandemic. So January 15, no more plastic bags in Maine. We're hoping to bring the producer responsibility bill back. It kind of got waylaid by the pandemic. It hadn't gotten through committee yet, so I think it will probably have to start over when the legislature starts again. But certainly lots of conversations about kind of getting rid of so much packaging around the state.
Yeah, thanks. My favorite way to reduce packaging is to shop local.
Yes, absolutely. And just a plug for One Climate Future. Certainly, the economic sustainability is a local business circulates money around your community, so you help, and buying local helps support your neighbors, have jobs, but it also helps other small businesses, because most small businesses hire business services from other local business people. So it just keeps circulating that money in our community as opposed to shipping it out. So that's going to be a key part of a sustainable economy. So thanks for the opportunity.
Here. Sure. Of course, sure. So we are unfortunately out of time, but I just want to thank you all again so much. This has been a great session, a great way to wrap up the panel discussion portion of our Staying Above Water Symposium. And I just want to put in another plug for those of you who haven't registered yet for our keynote next week. Next Thursday at 4 p.m. is going to be with Jeff Goodell. Keith Carson from News Center Maine is going to be moderating. And I think Kate will throw up a link in the chat for those of you who want to register for that. I think it's going to be great. Thank you, Kate. So thank you all so much again, and thank you all for joining us. And we will see you next week, next Thursday at 4 p.m.